Добро пожаловать в штаб-квартире Binkov.
Welcome to Binkov's headquarters. How would a war between Norway and Sweden go? The two countries both have fairly large land masses, which are sparsely populated. Throughout the Cold War, they've been preparing defenses against a possible Soviet threat, a much stronger opponent. That has left them with a quite robust defensive capabilities for their size. The two countries also spend similar amounts on defense, but with higher prices and wages in Norway, Sweden might get more for their money. They still differ quite a bit on what each has prioritized, with Sweden, for example, accentuating their air force more. Swedes have almost doubled the number of combat planes. Their support aircraft fleet is also more varied and better equipped. Norway's F-16s are fairly modern and are larger than Swedish Gripens. Both have strengths and weaknesses. Even though Gripens may come out as slightly better, they're both capable enough to represent a potent adversary to one another. Still, with such numbers and some AWACS edge, Swedes would be more likely to deny most of their airspace to Norway. But because of the size of the two countries and mountainous terrain, fully denying shallow incursions into each other's territory would be impossible for both sides, especially for Norway, with its narrow and long landmass. Both countries are well versed in dispersing their air forces. The air war would thus be a long series of sudden incursions over the border to bomb each other's assets, with only occasional intercepts. Sweden is better suited to such a war of attrition due to large numbers of their planes, but because of Norway's better air defenses, that edge would be somewhat blunted. Norway could also count on some additional medium-range air defenses from their navy in certain areas. Swedish Navy lacks similar systems. Navies of both sides would actually be relegated to a defensive role. Norway's navy does have ocean-going ships, but overall it is still configured for defense. Swedish Navy is even more defense-oriented. Both have capable submarine fleets, which would do most of the fighting. But with narrow and shallow seas, it would really be a stalemate. Neither side could gain much by pressing on with their navy. That would be further accentuated by lack of large amphibious ships on both sides. Both sides have only a few small landing craft. Sweden does possess much larger assault boat fleet, but again, disembarking a squad of soldiers without heavy support and logistics wouldn't help much. To conclude, Sweden would eventually control the skies over Norway, enough so that any Norwegian incursion into Sweden with a large army formation would be in danger. But at the same time, Norwegian air defenses and sporadic air force interceptions would complicate Swedish exploitation of their relative air superiority. Furthermore, due to geography and vast areas covered with forests, actually finding ground targets which aren't fixed would be quite problematic. The mountainous terrain, lakes and abundant forests, coupled with ample snow cover, would also mean ground war with large vehicle formations would be hard to wage. The defender in an urban or forest area could stop a more numerous attacker. On the ground, if war comes overnight, a swift Swedish action could press towards Oslo if needed, as Sweden has more of its ground troops stationed in the south. Norway could push into Sweden up north, but terrain would slow down a large formation, and supplying it would be hard. Such a move would not hurt Sweden much, and would tie the badly needed forces for defense of Oslo. Both countries have a home guard system which mobilizes reservists and which would fairly quickly outnumber the active army attacking force, meeting them in urban areas. Sweden has a larger active army, and it is also made up of professional soldiers. Norway, however, has a larger home guard and reserve formation. Furthermore, due to Norway's conscription practice, it can count on somewhat better trained troops in its reserves. So after the initial Swedish push on Oslo, Norway might mobilize more reserve soldiers and stop such an offensive. Swedes would have to stop, as rushing into urban and forest environments against an opponent who is quickly becoming more numerous would risk losing much of their heavy equipment edge over Norway. Swedish army does have more tanks, infantry fighting vehicles and armored vehicles altogether, with Norway holding a slight edge in artillery. It would be next to impossible for Norway, especially with Swedish aircraft patrolling overhead, to push back the entrenched Swedes. The long front line over the Scandinavian mountains would be quite hard to traverse, and both sides could only count on small formations of soldiers without much support, not enough for properly taking and controlling the other side's territory. Sweden could try to sporadically cut off Norway in two pieces, helped by helicopter and paratroop assaults, as it has more airlift platforms. But with few economic and military targets up north, such incursions would yield little benefit, would be hard to supply, and would be of short duration. They might also result in higher Swedish casualties once Norway does respond. Both countries have competent domestic weapons industry, but Sweden does have a bigger population. So in a prolonged war, the stalemate on the front would give way to Sweden taking some more of Norway's territory. There is simply too much territory to defend for Norway, and Sweden would have more freshly mobilized civilians. In the end, Sweden could be labeled as a winner, but it would not really be able to take any of the large cities or important areas in Norway. If you like my videos, do subscribe, and if you really like them, you can support me via Patreon. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.